Wait a second. What you're about to hear has been hidden behind Hollywood glamour for decades, and once you know the truth, you'll never watch classic movies the same way again. You have seen the photographs, the perfectly lit faces, the glossy magazine covers, the red carpet smiles frozen in black and white. You have heard the names spoken with reverence, names that became synonymous with elegance, power, mystique, and the American dream. You believed in those smiles, didn't you? You accepted the stories, you trusted the studios, forget all of it. Because beneath the silver screen, beneath every perfectly composed publicity shot, every carefully worded biography, every manufactured quote given to a compliant press, there existed a parallel world. A world of fabricated childhoods and erased ethnicities. A world where real people were dismantled like old machinery and rebuilt as consumer products for mass consumption. We're going down to the basement of the Dream Factory today. And what we find there is not glamour. It is something far more unsettling. Today we are examining 10 Hollywood legends, and it is worth noting from the outset that all 10 of these individuals were, according to available records, of remarkably similar stature. Each one stood at approximately the same height. A curious footnote, perhaps, but even that small physical detail reminds us how thoroughly the studio system controlled every measurable aspect of a performer's identity, down to the inches listed in their official profiles. Nothing, truly nothing, was left to chance or truth. These are 10 names you know, 10 images you recognize, and 10 secret lives the industry worked very hard to ensure you would never discover. The final story in this list is perhaps the most sobering of all, a reminder that even the most beloved icons were, in the end, products of a machine that valued illusion above everything. But before we get to the first name, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and like the video. It helps us keep telling the stories that the history books prefer to leave in the dark. To the audiences of the 1930s and 1940s, Merle Oberon was the definition of old-world refinement. Her cheekbones were spoken of as though they had been sculpted by a classical artist. Her voice carried a faint, elegant lilt that suggested drawing rooms and countryside estates. She appeared opposite Laurence Olivier in Wuthering Heights in 1939, and critics described her as luminous, aristocratic, almost otherworldly. She was, by all studio accounts, a proud daughter of Tasmania, born to a white British family, raised with the quiet dignity of the empire behind her. But the Tasmania story was a fabrication. According to historical records and extensive biographical research conducted after her death, Merle Oberon was born in Bombay, India, in 1911. Her full name was Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson. She was of mixed Anglo-Indian heritage, a background that, in the racially stratified entertainment industry of that era, could have ended a career before it began. The studios of that period operated under assumptions and prejudices that now seem almost incomprehensible, but were then entirely routine. A woman of mixed heritage, particularly one whose roots traced back to colonial India, would face barriers in Hollywood that no amount of talent could easily overcome. And so, the machinery was set in motion. The reinvention was systematic. Publicists crafted a biography that placed her birth in the Southern Hemisphere, assigned her white British parents, and gave her a respectable, uncomplicated background. The story was repeated in interviews, printed in fan magazines, and recited with such consistency that it calcified into accepted fact. Oberon herself became a meticulous guardian of this constructed identity. According to accounts from people who knew her, she went so far as to deny or minimize contact with family members who could contradict the official story. People connected to her real past, people who knew her true origins, were reportedly kept at a careful distance or quietly discouraged from speaking. What is perhaps most striking, from a historical standpoint, is not simply that the deception occurred, but that it was maintained so completely for so long. The system that demanded this reinvention, the studio apparatus, the distribution networks, the marketing machinery, did not simply tolerate the erasure of Oberon's real identity. According to available evidence, it required it. The question of who bears responsibility for that demand is one that film historians continue to examine. But if Merle Oberon's story represents the erasure of an entire ethnic identity, the next name on our list reveals something arguably stranger: the invention of a fantasy aristocracy from pure imagination. In the early 1940s, Laird Cregar emerged as one of Hollywood's most compelling character actors, a physically imposing, intellectually striking performer who seemed to arrive fully formed from some Gothic corner of the imagination. He was memorable in films like I Wake Up Screaming and The Lodger, where his large frame and unsettling intensity made him a natural fit for roles requiring menace and psychological complexity. Critics noted his talent with admiration. Fans found him fascinating. And Cregar himself, if the biographical interviews of the time are to be believed, had an extraordinary life story to match his extraordinary screen presence. He had been educated in England, he suggested. He had trained on prestigious British stages. His family background was distinguished. And there was one particularly dramatic detail that Cregar reportedly offered in certain circles: that he was descended, in some fashion, from the lineage of John Wilkes Booth, the figure associated with one of American history's most infamous events. He also, according to biographers who later examined his records, presented himself as several years younger than he actually was. According to the research of biographers who investigated his background after his early death in 1944, at only 31 years old, essentially none of these biographical claims held up to scrutiny. The prestigious English education appears to have had no documentary foundation. The aristocratic ancestry was not supported by records. The age, by available evidence, had been quietly adjusted downward. What Cregar actually possessed was genuine, remarkable talent, but in a system that valued mythology alongside performance, he apparently felt compelled to construct a persona to match the grandeur of the roles he played. There is something almost melancholy about this, examined from a distance. Cregar's real story, a young man of significant gifts navigating an industry that placed enormous pressure on image and biography, would have been compelling enough. Instead, he appears to have felt that the truth required embellishment. The system that created that pressure remains worth examining. And the fact that Cregar himself may never have fully untangled his public persona from his private self is a theme that recurs with striking frequency throughout this list. The next name involves not an adult constructing a new identity, but a child, and the adult who made that decision on her behalf. Betty Grable is one of the most enduring icons of mid-century American entertainment. During the Second World War, her photograph was reportedly the most widely reproduced image in the Allied forces, pinned to barracks walls and carried in uniform pockets as a symbol of home, normalcy, and the world that soldiers were fighting to return to. Her smile was described as the most recognizable in the world. Her legs were insured by Lloyd's of London for a sum that entered the realm of legend. She was the girl next door, amplified to mythological scale. But Betty Grable's entry into Hollywood began with a lie told on her behalf by her own mother. According to biographical accounts, when Grable was brought to studios in the early 1930s, at an age that was, depending on the source, either 12 or 13 years old, her mother informed producers that she was 15. The reason was pragmatic, and the implications were considerable. A 15-year-old could work in the film industry under the regulations of the period, with considerably fewer complications than a child of 12. The false age made her employment legally smoother and professionally viable. What is particularly worth examining here is not the individual decision made by a stage mother in the early years of the Depression, but the environment that made such a decision feel necessary and functional. Studios of that era were not asking careful questions. The machinery of casting and discovery was built for speed and efficiency, not for child welfare. A mother presenting a young daughter and adding a few years to her age was operating within a system that had created exactly the conditions for such transactions to occur without consequence. The industry absorbed the deception and moved forward. Grable herself would go on to a career of enormous success, and by the time of her peak fame in the 1940s, the question of her precise age at her earliest film appearances had long since been buried beneath layers of official biography. But the record of how that career began raises questions about the structures of oversight, or the absence of them, that governed the treatment of children in the studio system. The next entry involves a different kind of reinvention, one shaped not by a stage mother or a studio publicist, but by the historical forces of a world at war. Silent film audiences of the 1920s knew Norman Cary as a dashing leading man, handsome in the particular chiseled style that the era demanded, capable of projecting heroism and romantic intensity in a medium that required all emotion to be communicated without words. He appeared alongside Lon Chaney in The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera, films that represented the apex of silent cinema's ambitions. He was, to the audiences of his time, thoroughly and unambiguously American. What those audiences did not know was that Norman Cary had not always been Norman Cary. His original surname was Kaiser. According to historical records, the name was changed during the years surrounding the First World War, a period in which German surnames in the United States had become, to put it gently, commercially inconvenient. Anti-German sentiment in American society during that period was intense, and for those in the public eye, potentially career-defining. A performer with a German-sounding name faced a market that had little appetite for that particular identity. The renaming of Norman Kaiser as Norman Cary, in isolation, a relatively modest act of reinvention. But it is worth examining in the context of the other stories on this list, because it reveals something about the relationship between identity and marketability that ran through the entire studio era. The principle that a performer's actual identity was subordinate to the requirements of the marketplace, that a name, an ethnicity, a background, a heritage could be adjusted in response to commercial pressures, was not a rare exception. It was a working assumption of the industry. And if the pressures of wartime nationalism could reshape a man's very name, the next entry shows us a star who chose to reshape herself by refusing to be known at all. Jean Arthur was, by most critical accounts, one of the finest comedic and dramatic actresses of Hollywood's golden age. Her slightly husky voice, her capacity for conveying both wry intelligence and genuine vulnerability, and her remarkable screen presence made her a major star of the 1930s and 1940s. She appeared in Frank Capra's films, in westerns, in screwball comedies. Directors and co-stars frequently spoke of her talent with admiration that bordered on awe. And yet Jean Arthur was, by the standards of her time, almost aggressively unknowable. She gave interviews rarely and reluctantly. She resisted the publicity machinery that other stars navigated as a professional obligation. Even details that might seem unremarkable, her birth name, the precise circumstances of her early life, the chronology of her biography before Hollywood, were obscured, contradicted, or simply not available in the public record for years. She was known to the public primarily through her performances, while her actual person remained carefully concealed. The persona she maintained was sometimes described as the mystery woman of Hollywood. Studios, which generally preferred their stars to be accessible and biographically transparent for publicity purposes, found in Arthur a subject who resisted their management of her image in a different way than most. Rather than constructing a false biography for consumption, she appears to have preferred the construction of an absence, a deliberate withholding that made her both more intriguing and more frustrating for the publicity apparatus to manage. What remains compelling about Arthur's story, viewed historically, is the question of what she was protecting and why. The studio system was built on the premise that stars were public property, that their lives, their relationships, their pasts were legitimately part of the commercial product being sold to audiences. Arthur's resistance to that premise, whatever its personal motivations, placed her in quiet but persistent conflict with the industry's fundamental assumptions about what it owned. The next star on our list had no such resistance. She was instead remade from the outside. Greta Garbo was born Greta Lovisa Gustafsson in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1905. Her family background was modest. Her father worked as a laborer and died when she was young, and she spent part of her childhood in some financial difficulty. She was discovered by a Swedish director who recognized her potential, which eventually led to her arrival in Hollywood in the mid-1920s. What the studios received was an extraordinarily talented young woman of working-class origins and genuine artistic gifts. What audiences received was something considerably more elaborate. MGM's publicity apparatus transformed Greta Gustafsson into Greta Garbo, a name that suggested neither working-class Sweden nor the specific geography of Stockholm's less affluent districts, but rather a kind of weightless European mystery. The biographical material distributed by the studio emphasized the mystique of the continent, the inscrutability of the Nordic temperament, the ineffable quality of someone who seemed to belong to no particular time or place. The actual facts of her background, the laborer father, the financial hardship, the ordinary Swedish childhood, were not part of the promoted story. Garbo's famous reclusiveness, which intensified as her career progressed and became perhaps the most discussed aspect of her public persona, can be read in several ways. One interpretation is that it was a natural expression of genuine introversion. Another is that it was, at least in part, a rational response to the experience of having had her real identity systematically replaced by a manufactured one. When the public face is a construction, withdrawal from public engagement is not necessarily mysterious. It may be the most honest option available. The studio system that transformed Greta Gustafsson into Greta Garbo did not ask her permission for the details of the mythology it constructed. It presented the mythology as the reality, promoted it globally, and expected compliance. That this compliance was given, and that the actual woman remained largely inaccessible behind the myth, is perhaps less a story about Garbo's enigmatic nature than about the conditions the industry created around her. The next star's story involves not just the erasure of her background, but the literal physical alteration of her body to match the image the industry required. Rita Hayworth is regarded by many film historians as one of the most genuinely charismatic performers of the classic Hollywood era. Her dancing was exceptional. She trained from early childhood in a professional dance family, and her screen presence had a warmth and vitality that could not be entirely manufactured. Films like Gilda placed her in the cultural imagination as the archetypal noir goddess, an image so powerful that it traveled beyond cinema into broader cultural mythology. But the Rita Hayworth that audiences saw had been substantially reconstructed from the woman who arrived at the studios. She was born Margarita Carmen Cancino in 1918. Her heritage was Spanish, and her family was deeply rooted in Spanish performance traditions. Her father, Eduardo Cancino, was a renowned Spanish dancer, and her mother was of Irish and English descent. The Spanish side of her identity was, by the standards of studio-era Hollywood, commercially complicated. The industry of that period was highly attentive to the ethnic and racial categorizations of its performers, and Spanish occupied an ambiguous and sometimes disadvantageous position in the hierarchy of marketable identities. The transformation was methodical. Her dark hair was lightened. Her hairline, which had the characteristic low placement associated with her Spanish heritage, was altered through electrolysis, a painful process performed repeatedly over time, to create a higher, broader forehead that was considered more consistent with mainstream American beauty standards. Her last name was changed. The Spanish identity was minimized in her promotional materials, and she was presented as Rita Hayworth, American star, with her heritage reduced to an exotic footnote if it was mentioned at all. It is important to note that Hayworth, by later accounts, had a complicated and at times painful relationship with this transformation. The erasure of her ethnic identity, combined with difficult personal circumstances that extended well beyond her professional life, created conditions that biographers have carefully examined. The image of Rita Hayworth that became iconic was, in a very direct sense, not entirely her own. It was a product built on her body and her talent, but shaped according to priorities that were not hers. The industry that built that product and profited from it did not necessarily consider what the cost of that construction might be for the person inside it. The next story takes us to the most famous masculine icon of the era, and the lengths to which the studio went to ensure that not even the most human vulnerability could become visible. Clark Gable was, in the parlance of his era, a man's man. MGM positioned him as the embodiment of American masculine idealism, rugged, confident, physically imposing, effortlessly dominant in every scene he occupied. His nickname, the King of Hollywood, was not ironic. It was a reflection of the extraordinary commercial and cultural power he wielded during the height of his career. It happened one night, won him an Academy Award. Gone with the Wind made him a permanent feature of American cultural memory. He was, by design and by outcome, larger than life. The design required maintenance. MGM's publicity and management apparatus worked continuously to ensure that the image of Clark Gable, the king, the ideal, remained free of any detail that might introduce human vulnerability or diminishment. According to biographical accounts and historical research into the studio's operations during this period, this maintenance extended into some surprisingly intimate territory. Gable reportedly suffered significant dental problems at various points in his career and wore dentures for much of his peak period of fame. This information, entirely unremarkable in human terms, the kind of detail that affects millions of people, was treated by the studio as a matter requiring careful management and concealment. The logic behind this concealment is worth examining. The studio system had identified a commercial proposition, Clark Gable as the perfect, invulnerable American male. Any detail that complicated that proposition, any human frailty, any physical imperfection, any suggestion that the man behind the icon was ordinary flesh and bone with ordinary human vulnerabilities, was a potential threat to the commercial value of the image. So, the detail was hidden. The king remained perfect, at least in the public record, because the machinery required perfection and was willing to work to maintain it. What is striking, looking back, is the thoroughness with which MGM managed not just Gable's image, but the information environment around him. The studio controlled press access, cultivated sympathetic journalists, and operated in an era before the kind of independent reporting that might have made such management more difficult. Gable, by most accounts, was a willing participant in the construction of his own myth, but the myth was not his creation. It was the studio's property, built on his face and his talent, and the studio protected it accordingly. But if Gable's story is about the concealment of ordinary human detail, by the time Cary Grant became one of the biggest movie stars in the world, audiences believed they were watching a man who seemed effortlessly sophisticated, a charming English gentleman who had always belonged among the wealthy and refined. But Cary Grant was not born Cary Grant, and the life he came from looked nothing like the elegant persona Hollywood sold to the public. He was born Archibald Leach in Bristol, England, into a poor working-class family. His childhood was marked by instability and hardship, a reality that conflicted sharply with the polished identity he later presented. As a boy, he was told that his mother had gone on a long vacation. Only years later did he learn the truth. She had been placed in a mental institution by his father and remained there for decades. This part of Grant's story was largely unknown to the public during the height of his career. Instead, studios promoted the image of a confident and self-made gentleman, someone who seemed naturally at ease in high society. The transformation from Archibald Leach into Cary Grant was not just a name change. It was a complete reinvention. Grant later admitted that the persona audiences saw on screen was something he consciously constructed. He once explained that he had spent years trying to become the man people believed Cary Grant to be. The confident charm and effortless elegance were not inherited traits, but carefully developed performances that extended beyond the camera. Even his accent evolved over time into a distinctive blend that did not fully belong to any single place, reinforcing the idea of Cary Grant as a figure slightly removed from ordinary reality. The result was one of the most convincing reinventions in Hollywood history. A man who replaced his real identity with a new one so completely that millions of people never realized the difference. By the time the illusion was complete, Archibald Leach had effectively disappeared behind the image of Cary Grant. And for decades, the public knew only the version that Hollywood had created, a man who seemed born to elegance rather than someone who had struggled to escape a difficult past. If Cary Grant reinvented himself as an adult, the next story begins even earlier, with a young performer whose age itself became part of the fiction. Clara Bow is, in many respects, the foundational Hollywood icon, the original It Girl, the figure who defined the particular brand of vivid electric screen presence that the industry had been trying to manufacture and replicate ever since. Her energy was genuine and considerable. Her talent was real. When she appeared on screen, the camera registered something that could not be entirely accounted for by direction or lighting or the craft of the other performers around her. She was, by almost any measure, the thing the industry was always claiming to have and rarely actually possessed, a true original. And yet the Clara Bow that entered the professional world was, from her earliest steps into that world, taught that she was a raw material requiring processing. According to biographical accounts of her early career, she was discovered through a beauty contest as a teenager in the early 1920s and entered the professional film world before she had fully completed her adolescence. The industry received her not as a complete person, but as a set of physical and performative characteristics that could be shaped according to demand. She reportedly altered her appearance, adjusted her presentation, and adapted her personal narrative to match the varying requirements of different auditions and opportunities. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, precisely what the industry asked of virtually every young performer who passed through its gates. But in Bow's case, there is a particular poignancy to it, because what the industry was processing was someone who had come from circumstances of genuine hardship, a difficult childhood in Brooklyn, family trauma, poverty, and who arrived in Hollywood with the kind of unguarded vitality that tends to emerge from people who have not yet been thoroughly managed. The management came quickly, the image was shaped, the personal narrative was refined and standardized. The It Girl was constructed around and partially from the actual girl, and the two became increasingly difficult to separate. By the time Clara Bow's career reached its peak in the late 1920s, she was one of the most commercially successful performers in the world, and also one of the most thoroughly scrutinized and, according to many accounts, one of the most personally beleaguered. The gap between the vibrant screen image and the private experience of the woman sustaining that image was, by multiple biographical accounts, considerable. The system that had processed her so efficiently in her teenage years continued to process her, and the processing had costs that the box office receipts did not reflect. 10 names, 10 lives, 10 constructed identities, assembled with varying degrees of coercion, calculation, and what we might charitably describe as creative interpretation. And these, it must be said, represent merely a fraction of the stories that exist within the archive of classic Hollywood's relationship with truth. What connects them is not simply deception of a kind or scale that makes any one case uniquely monstrous. What connects them is a system, a machinery that was built from its earliest days on the premise that the human beings passing through its gates were commercial raw material, and that their identities, their names, their faces, their bodies, their ethnicities, their ages, their family histories, their actual selves were subordinate to the requirements of the market. The studios did not invent the social prejudices that made Merle Oberon's reinvention feel necessary, or that made Rita Hayworth's physical transformation commercially rational. They did not create the wartime nationalism that pressured Norman Kerry to shed his surname. They did not manufacture the particular vulnerability of children that made a 12-year-old's age a negotiable figure in an industry transaction. But they built structures that incorporated all of these pressures, institutionalized them, profited from them, and worked systematically to ensure that the human costs remained invisible behind the surface of the product. The men and women on this list were not simply victims of that machinery. Many of them were, in various ways, participants in it, because participation was, under the circumstances, often the only path to survival. The system did not typically offer a choice between maintaining your authentic identity and having a career. It offered the career in exchange for the identity. And the people who made that exchange cannot be judged simply for having made it, without also examining the conditions that structured the choice. What we are left with, examining these stories from a distance of decades, is something more complex than scandal. It is a portrait of an industry, and by extension of a culture, that required certain people to disappear in order to be visible. That demanded transformation as the price of admission. That built its mythology on the systematic erasure of the actual human beings who made that mythology possible. These 10 stories are not exceptional. They are illustrative. For every fabricated Tasmanian birthplace in the official record, there are dozens of others we have not examined. For every hairline altered by electrolysis, there are other transformations, other erasures, documented in archives that have not yet been fully opened. The question of how many more names remain hidden, how many more complete reinventions were executed so thoroughly that the original has been entirely lost, is one that film historians continue to pursue, and one that does not have a final answer. You have looked behind the curtain today. The mechanism is visible now, if only briefly. The truth, partial, imperfect, still incomplete, has found its way to the surface. What you do with it is, as it always has been, up to you.